Hello again. If you saw the video we did a few days ago on Wilberforce, Wheat and Weeds, remember we referred to this Watchtower Publications Index, 1930 to 1985, which was the index that I used during my prime years in Jehovah's Witnesses. And we lamented the fact that when I later looked for a reference to William Wilberforce in the book, I found not a single listing in the index. I tried it again the other day for a figure of great interest from a generation or so before Wilberforce, Jonathan Edwards, who has been called the greatest mind America has ever produced. Its greatest theologian, for sure. Maybe the greatest mind America has ever produced. Greatest thinker, which of course makes him the greatest Christian thinker, because he was a Christian, a Congregationalist minister who lived from 1703 to 1758. And when he had died, after the Great Awakening, so-called, had left a mark that is still with us today. So his works are still in print. I didn't find a single reference to him in the Watchtower Index. I guess when you think about it, you can't be too surprised, because after all, the very presence in history of men like Wilberforce and Edwards would put a lie to the Watchtower narrative that God has not been working within Christendom. And I guess you could say God has not been at work in the world since the apostles died off, because the apostasy, according to this restorationist viewpoint, that, by the way, the Watchtower is not alone in, would lead to the conclusion that, well, Matthew 28:18 is not being fulfilled, is it? I am with you always, even all the days, literally in Greek, until the end of the world. So, I couldn't help but think of Edwards when I was musing upon Edwards the other day, because of this book, The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, put out in 1994 by Mark Noll. I advocate, by the way, that you get as many videos, there's quite a few of them on YouTube, videos, interviews of his lectures too. These are all helpful when it comes to understanding the history of his, specifically American religion, over these last 400 years. So Mark Noll, still with us in his 70s now, talks about the history of anti-intellectualism in America, just as you may have seen the prior video we did on this subject, done by Richard Hofstadter back in the early 1960s. Well, Mark Noll brings the discussion up to date, but takes us back too to the Middle Ages in analyzing what's gone wrong with evangelicalism. He talks about the Albigenses and the Cathari. Many Protestants are fascinated by the Albigenses, the Cathari, who existed in the Alpine regions of Europe back in the Middle Ages when the Catholic abuses were at their peak. And somehow we have a romantic view that the Albigenses and the Cathari were Protestants, at least neophyte Protestants before the Protestant Reformation. But when you get a little closer to what the Albigenses and the Cathari actually believed, you realize it's not exactly what we call Protestantism. Their tendency tended to be to deny the creation. So when the creation is neglected, of course, all the while you are dwelling upon Christian morality and life at the expense of the divine use of the mind, then of course certain tendencies will kick in. One of them would be a return to the old heresy of Manichaeism that Noll then talks about in his book. Manichaeism is a dualistic way of looking at the universe, which, like ancient Gnosticism, separates the physical creation from the spiritual realm. And of course that's not healthy if you're going to have a well-orbed view of what Christianity is all about. The result, as Noll says, was a group that did teach the church some valuable lessons about ethical seriousness, but it was also a group that, because it rejected in principle the cultivation of the mind, found itself trapped by a worldview alien to the gospel. That's his evaluation of the Albigenses. Then he talks about pietism, and pietism similarly stressed the living Christian experience. And of course, when living Christian experience and morality are stressed, again, the cost is a lack of emphasis upon other aspects, which leads us to the Reformation and beyond, where there was an effort made by Protestantism to bring things back into balance. Pietism was a very valuable form of Protestantism because it stressed living faith, but on the other hand, it too laid less emphasis or importance upon the role of the mind in the Christian life and witness. So Noll sums up the influence of pietism this way: at its extreme, the pietist emphasis on religious life gave very little attention to self-conscious Christian thought. To be consumed by feeling was to have no time for thinking through the relationship between God and his creation. Once this point had been reached, it soon became difficult to distinguish between those forms of feeling that remained within the Christian orbit and those that had spun off as meteorites with no fixed center. Pietism played an important role in the revitalization of the church in the 17th and 18th centuries. Unchecked pietism, however, played a role in the development of theological liberalism, with liberalism's fascination for the forms of religious experience. Pietism sometimes led to a morbid fixation upon the Christian's personal state at the expense of evangelism, study, or social outreach. Then he gets into the Enlightenment proper, and this is where Jonathan Edwards enters the picture in Mark Noll's evaluation of why this happened. He talks about Edwards this way: when we study something, we are of course learning about that thing, but even more, we are learning about the one who made that thing. The Enlightenment, therefore, was the first time in history, since at least the Greeks were in their prime around 400 BC, that the Western world had looked seriously at the creation as a whole and studied it in its various categories and compartments. Noll goes on, ironically, some of the clearest expressions of this reality came from an American evangelical, Jonathan Edwards, whose intellectual legacy, as we will see in the next chapter, was abandoned by later American evangelicals. When he was still in his teens, the young Jonathan Edwards wrote down an extensive description of the shape, construction, and purpose of a spider's web. There are many true things we can say about the physical character of the web, but according to Edwards, the ultimate thing shown by the spider in its spinning is the exuberant goodness of the Creator, who hath not only provided for all the necessities, but also for the pleasure and recreation of all sorts of creatures, even the insects. That's a quote from Edwards directly. Then Noll says, when he was older, Edwards put the matter more formally. True knowledge was not, in the last analysis, an abstract correspondence of our thinking with reality. True knowledge was rather the consistency and agreement of our ideas with the ideas of God. The implications of this conviction for studying the world were equally clear, because it is God who created the things that people studied and who made it possible for humans to understand something of the world. Edwards held that all the arts and sciences, the more they are perfected, the more they issue in divinity and coincide with it and appear to be as parts of it. In a word, Edwards understood that the final reason for exercising our intelligence is to know more of God and his loving ways with the world. Noll goes on, for a Christian, the mind is important because God is important, who, after all, made the world of nature, and then made possible the development of sciences, through which we find out more about nature, who formed the universe of human interactions, and so provided the raw material of politics, economics, sociology, and history, who is the source of harmony, form, and narrative pattern, and so lies behind all artistic and literary possibilities, who created the human mind in such a way that it could grasp the realities of nature, of human interactions, of beauty, and so made possible the theories on such matters by philosophers and psychologists, who, moment by moment, sustains the natural world, the world of human interactions, and the harmonies of existence, who, moment by moment, maintains the connections between what is in our minds and what is in the world beyond our minds. At this point, Mark Noll seems to be alluding to the famous passage in Colossians where it says, Paul says of Christ that in him the universe is unified or coheres. Colossians 1 verses 14 to 18, I believe that is. In Christ the universe is not only made, but it coheres or is held together. This is a fantastic thought which illuminates the necessity of studying God's ways in creation, because we learn from the creation the manifold glories and ways of God. That's Mark Noll's position, and I believe he represents the position of Jonathan Edwards fairly. This is The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind by Mark Noll. Recommended reading.